Hello, I am Raymond Shadow. Imagine this, friends. Imagine you are standing alone at the foot of a towering snow-capped mountain. The world before your eyes is a suffocatingly pure white. Golden sunlight spills onto glacier that have not melted for 10,000 years, refracting a divine and inviolable radiance. It is an ultimate beauty. Beautiful enough to make you want to scream aloud, to want to freeze this moment forever. But, just as you are overwhelmed by this grandeur, a wave of uncontrollable sorrow wells up from the depths of your heart. This sorrow comes without reason, yet it submerges you like a tide. Because you know, with distinct clarity, that you cannot take away a single snowflake from this mountain. Nor can you keep a single moment of this shifting light and shadow. The magnificence of this second will vanish completely in the next with the rising mist. Even if you take a photo, even if you return next year, that will not be today's snow mountain, and it certainly won't be today's you. This trembling of the heart, born from the realization that beautiful things must eventually fade, is the core code of Japanese literature and philosophy we are exploring today. A mono no aware. Friends, following our last discussion on the philosophy of the Kyoto school, today we continue to talk about the Japan I love. We enter this profound world regarding beauty, time, and death. To truly read Japanese literature and philosophy, or even to read the soul of the Japanese nation, we must master this key. This concept was not clearly visible at the start. It was like an underground river, flowing for 1,000 years. It wasn't until the 18th century that a master named Moturi Norinaga, acting like a spiritual surgeon, dissected the millennium-old masterpiece The Tale of Genji. He extracted the pearl of a mono no aware from it and told the world, this is the true source of the Japanese spirit. So, what exactly is mono no aware? It is not merely the literal sorrow of things. In ancient Japanese, a mono refers to the myriad things of the world, while a aware was originally just an interjection. It is similar to that low, involuntary bar that escapes our throats when we see autumn leaves falling or hear a deer cry in the deep mountains. It is a keen sensitivity to the other, to nature, and to the transience of all things. It contains joy, surprise, and pity, but ultimately, all these emotions merge into one river, the confirmation of the impermanence, mujo. This is why the Japanese are so obsessed with cherry blossoms, sakura. In the Western aesthetic tradition, people sing praises of the blooming rose or the eternal diamond. But in the East, in this narrow island nation, people believe that the cherry blossom is beautiful not because of its brilliance when in full bloom, but because it scatters with the wind without hesitation at its most glorious moment. Only when beauty begins to die does it reach its climax. This unique temperament makes Japanese literature seem out of place in the world of letters, yet filled with a fatal attraction. When we read Western classics, like Balzac or Hemingway, we see hard rocks, intense conflict, and the will of man conquering nature. But when you open a book by a Japanese author, from Murasaki Shikibu 1,000 years ago, to the modern Natsume Soseki and Kawabata Yasunari, down to the contemporary Murakami Haruki, you will find their words are soft. They wrap around you like water, but at the same time, they prick you precisely like a needle. Because these writers do not care about grand historical narratives, they care about only one thing: the trembling produced in the heart at that specific moment in the now. To understand how this literary temperament was formed, we cannot stop at theory. We need to turn the clock back over 1,000 years, to the childhood of Japanese literature, to witness a war regarding a language. This was, in fact, the key battle for the awakening of the Japanese soul, the game between kanji, Chinese characters, and kana. Think of medieval Europe. Latin was holy and official, while the vernaculars of various countries were considered vulgar. In ancient Japan, under the immense influence of China's Tang dynasty culture, kanji was their Latin. Early important works, such as Japan's earliest poetry collection Manyoshu and the history chronicle Kojiki, were all written in kanji. This brought about a huge awkwardness. Think about it, Japan initially had only a language, no writing system. To record their voices, they had to borrow kanji. This gave birth to the so-called amanyogana. Simply put, borrowing the pronunciation of kanji to record Japanese, completely disregarding the original meaning of the characters. For example, the Japanese word for mountain is gyama. They might write it using the kanji byima. It's like using broken English phonetics to annotate Chinese. Although clumsy, this marked Japan's attempt to possess its own voice. However, this borrowed writing system was like a heavy suit of armor, encasing the original soft, ambiguous, polysyllabic sense of the Japanese language. For the male aristocrats of the time, skillfully writing kanji and quoting Chinese classics were symbols of status and power. They used kanji to write history, laws, and those solemn official documents. Kanji was considered the masculine, male, orthodox amana, true name. However, human emotion is not always grand. More often, it is fragmented, private, and indescribable. When you want to describe the emotion evoked by the purplish clouds at a spring dawn, rigid kanji becomes inadequate. Thus, history took a marvelous turn around the 10th century during the Heian period. This was an era of extreme elegance, even a somewhat decadent aristocratic age. In this period, the two most important things for Japanese literature were born. First was hiragana. This is a phonetic script formed by fluid lines, evolved from cursive-style kanji. Second was the explosion of a women's literature. This might sound ironic. In Japanese society at the time, men were in absolute dominance. They controlled kanji, the true name. The newly invented hiragana, because of its soft lines and simple writing, was denigrated as bonade, woman's handwriting, something for women to use for writing love letters or keeping diaries. But precisely this arrogance inadvertently achieved the most glorious moment in Japanese literature. Because men were boxed in by serious kanji, they could only write dry, boring things. Meanwhile, women living deep in the palace courts, like Murasaki Shikibu and Sei Shonagon, had no such burden. They used this woman's writing, hiragana, that men looked down upon, to practice a writing my hand as my mouth speaks. They freely recorded every detail of daily life, the love and hate between men and women, and the sensitive melancholy brought by the changing seasons. Imagine the scene, inside the deep palace of Heiankyo, those noble women wearing the junihaito, 12-layered kimono, lived all day behind curtains called kicho. Their bodies were heavily bound, but their senses were thus developed to the extreme. They possessed a capture ability more precise than radar for the movement of light and shadow, and the sense brought by the wind. The most typical representative is Sei Shonagon and her essay collection The Pillow Book, Makura no Soshi. If not for that soft system of kana, rather than rigid kanji, this texture, delicate as silk, could absolutely not have been recorded. Let's listen to how she describes the seasons. This isn't just landscape writing, this is evidence of the awakening of human senses. She writes in the book, in spring, the dawn is the most beautiful. As the mountain rim slowly turns white, it becomes slightly bright, and purplish thin clouds trail softly above it. Please note, she didn't capture the magnificence of the sun rising, but the subtle, fleeting purple produced by light refracting through the clouds. In summer, the night is best. Not to mention when there is a moon, but even in the dark nights with no moon, fireflies flying about. In autumn, the dusk is best. The setting sun shines brilliantly, reflecting quietly on the mountain edge. Crows returning to their nests, flying by in threes, fours, or twos, add to the sadness. This phrase threes, fours, or twos is simply a stroke of genius. She didn't vaguely say a flock of crows. She was like she was counting, freezing the frame. This point-like visual description hits directly at the softest part of the reader's heart. This isn't just describing scenery, this is writing about loneliness. Writing about the desolation of watching all things return home while I gaze alone. In winter, the early morning is best. Even without snow or frost, when the cold is piercing, one hurriedly lights a fire, carrying charcoal running through the corridor. She writes about the trajectory of that red charcoal fire moving through the cold white morning. The visual tension produced by the contrast of warmth and cold. Friends, this is the concrete manifestation of a mono no aware. Precisely because it broke free from the shackles of kanji's grand narratives, Japanese literature touched the depths of the human heart for the first time. This literary creation dominated by women set the tone of feminine beauty for Japanese literature. This is also why, in world literary history, it is hard to find another country like Japan where the golden source of its literature was opened by women. In contemporary Europe, women were still in the Dark Middle Ages. In China, although there were the great song lyrics, female writers were still rare as phoenix feathers. But in Japan, the Tale of Genji, the Pillow Book, and the Diary of Izumi Shikabu, these three masterpieces of the Heian period, were all written by women. With delicate strokes, they implanted a sensitive and sentimental heart into this martial nation. The influence of this cultural gene is profound. Until today, more than 1,000 years later, when modern Japanese writers look back at their cultural traditions, they still cast their gaze toward the Heian period. Toward those diaries and tales written in kana. Because therein lies the truest soul of the Japanese. This desinization of indigenous writing movement not only established the Japanese writing system but, more importantly, established the Japanese worldview. That is, do not pursue grand eternity. Pay attention to tiny moments. Love those fragile things. Because beauty exists in that moment of imminent disappearance. And it is this unique temperament that gives Japanese literature its irreplaceable position in the world of letters. However, if the Pillow Book is a bright, witty collection of essays, a snapshot of life's moments, then in this period there is another, grander work. It not only records moments, it pushes this aesthetic of a mono no aware to the height of philosophy. Through the romantic history of one man, it writes out the nihilism and desolation of life completely. That is the work regarded by Kawabata Yasunari as the pinnacle of Japanese literature. Considered the world's first full-length novel, The Tale of Genji, Genji Monogatari. Many Western readers compare it to Japan's Dream of the Red Chamber or Proust's In Search of Lost Time. This masterpiece, completed around the year 1008 AD, is not only the great synthesis of the mono no aware aesthetic but also the ultimate code for us to understand Japanese culture. More than 1,000 years ago, in the distant east, deep within a palace wrapped in heavy curtains in Kyoto, a dim oil lamp was lit. A court lady named Murasaki Shikabu was kneeling on the tatami. Perhaps she had just finished a day of tedious court service. Looking at the cold moon outside the window, listening to the autumn wind blowing through the grass in the garden, she felt a loneliness that could not be dispelled. So, she spread out a sheet of expensive, faintly scented washi paper, picked up a brush, dipped it in pitch-black ink, and began to write a man's story. Once she started, she wrote a full 1,000,000 words. At that time, she absolutely would not have thought that she was creating a miracle in human literary history that had no predecessor and no equal. What she was writing was what later generations would recognize as the first novel in the modern sense in the history of world literature, The Tale of Genji. Friends, what kind of concept is this? This is a full 600 years earlier than the West's Don Quixote. 300 years earlier than Boccaccio's The Decameron. When Shakespeare was not even a thought in the womb. Murasaki Shikabu had already used this masterpiece to dissect the most subtle, complex, darkest, and most brilliant parts of human emotion to the fullest. The status of this book in Japan cannot be overstated. Kawabata Yasunari once said that since The Tale of Genji, although Japanese novels have been as numerous as hairs on an ox, none has surpassed it. It is like a giant pyramid standing at the source of Japanese literature, casting a long shadow that has covered the millennium that followed. So, what kind of book is this? If you only look at the surface or listen to some hearsay summaries, you might think, isn't this just a scumbag hunting history of a prince with amazing beauty and supreme power who sleeps around and even commits incest? The protagonist of the book is Hikaru Genji. In Japanese, Hikaru means shining or radiant. He was born with a main character aura. He is the emperor's favorite son, incomparably beautiful, overflowing with talent. Everyone who sees him, man or woman, falls for him. But if we merely treat it as an ancient version of the overbearing CEO falls in love with me or a collection of palace gossip, then we have sorely underestimated Murasaki Shikabu and Japanese literature. In reality, this is a psychological epic about a seeking and a losing. It is a tragedy about the nihilism of life wrapped in the most gorgeous silk. Let us put on the glasses of a mono no wearer and walk into Hikaru Genji's inner world. You will find that deep inside this man who possesses everything in the secular world, there is a huge, bottomless black hole. This black hole stems from a loss. When Genji was 3 years old, his mother, Kiritsubo no Koi, the Lady Kiritsubo, who was of low birth but greatly favored, died of depression due to the jealousy and exclusion of the harem. A 3-year-old child, before he could even remember his mother's face, lost her forever. This lack of maternal love became the curse of his life and the psychological root of all his absurd behaviors. He desperately searched for his mother's shadow in every woman. This explains why he committed the sin that was enough to cast him into hell. He fell madly in love with his stepmother, Empress Fujitsubo. Why? Not only because Fujitsubo was beautiful, but because everyone said Fujitsubo looked exactly like his dead mother. This was an extremely dangerous love, laden with an Oedipus complex. Genji knew this was treason, knew it was incest, but he couldn't control it. Under Murasaki Shikibu's pen, this forbidden love was not described as obscene or dirty, but rather filled with a soul-stirring poignant beauty. It was the resolve to jump off a cliff knowing fully well it was there. Because for Genji, embracing Fujitsubo was embracing that a maternal homelander he could never touch. To fill this black hole, Genji did something that looks extremely controversial, even terrifyingly creepy, today. During an outing, at a temple in the northern hills, he accidentally met a girl who was only 10 years old. In that instant, he was struck. Not just because the little girl was cute, but because he discovered that this girl was actually Empress Fujitsubo's niece. Between her brows and eyes, she had the exact same spirit as Fujitsubo, and thus, his mother. So, a crazy idea was born. Since I cannot possess Fujitsubo, I will manufacture a Fujitsubo myself. He forcibly took this 10-year-old girl back to his palace, Niho-in. This girl was the later famous Murasaki no Yui, Lady Murasaki Lavender. She is also the primary heroine of the entire book. This is what later generations call the Hikaru Genji plan. For the next dozen years, like the most patient gardener pruning a bonsai, he educated her, shaped her, and cultivated her according to the image of the perfect woman in his heart. He taught her to write, to paint, how to dress, and how to deal with people. When Murasaki grew up, she became the perfect ideal partner in Genji's heart, a combination of mother, lover, daughter, and soulmate. Does this sound like the horror of a control freak? But in the context of Japanese aesthetics, this actually reflects an extreme fear of impermanence. Subconsciously, Genji knew that people in reality change. And they will leave. Only an artwork created by his own hands has the potential to resist the flow of time, to possibly achieve eternity. He tried to freeze beauty within Murasaki. However, friends, what is the essence of a mono no aware? It is impermanence. It is that all things flow. It is that nothing can be eternal. Murasaki Shikibu's greatness lies in the fact that although she gave Genji everything, she revealed the laws of fate more coldly than anyone else. The second half of the novel is the cruelest portrayal of a karma. In his later years, although Genji had power over the world, he married a young main wife, the third princess, Ona-san no Miya. At this time, Genji had entered middle age, he was no longer that dashing young man. History is always amazingly similar, even carrying a malicious sense of humor. This young third princess committed adultery behind Genji's back with a young nobleman named Kashiwagi and became pregnant. When Genji discovered this secret, holding that baby who did not belong to him, in that moment, he did not fly into a rage. He did not kill to vent his anger like an ordinary man. Instead, he felt a bone-piercing coldness and nihilism. Because he suddenly realized, isn't this exactly what he did to his father back then? Back then, he slept with his father's woman, Fujitsubo, and fathered the illegitimate child, Emperor Reize. Now, fate had shot this bullet back right between his eyebrows. In this moment, all the glory and wealth, all the love and hate, appeared so pale, so laughable in the face of the closed loop of karma. He looked at the infant as if seeing his younger self and seeing the fate he could not escape. He spent his whole life pursuing love, pursuing beauty, wanting to fill that black hole. But in the end, he found he had grasped nothing. Under this immense mental blow, his life's beloved, Murasaki, died of illness before him. Murasaki's death completely hollowed out Genji's soul. At Murasaki's funeral, watching the smoke drift away with the wind, he finally thoroughly understood the true meaning of a mono no aware. Beauty is not possession. Beauty is loss. Precisely because you cannot keep it, precisely because it will eventually turn to ash, this life's entanglement has meaning. After this, Murasaki Shikibu made a move that can be called a miracle in world literary history. If you look at the table of contents of the Tale of Genji, you will see chapter 41. The name is Akumogakyo, vanished into the clouds. It is a very beautiful name, meaning to hide like a cloud, to disappear. However, when you open this chapter full of anticipation, wanting to see how our protagonist Genji finally dies, what his last words were, or how he repented on his sickbed, you will be shocked to find that what lies before your eyes is a blank space. This chapter has only a title. No text. Not a single word. For hundreds of years, countless scholars and readers have argued about why this is. Some say the original manuscript was lost. Some say Murasaki Shikibu wrote to this point and loved the character too much to bear writing his death. But in the tradition of Japanese aesthetics, this is viewed as a deliberate, ultimate art. Because death cannot be described. Death is not the opposite of life. Death is the continuation of life, it is a return to nothingness, mu. For a life as brilliant as Genji's, any textual description is superfluous, pale. Should it describe his haggard face? His breathing stopping? That would be too undignified. He should be like a cherry blossom scattered by the wind, like a cloud melting into the blue sky. This blank space forces all readers to stop. When you turn to this page, facing that vast whiteness, you will hear a silence more deafening than any language. In that moment, you are no longer a spectator. You are forced to participate in the ending of this story. You will feel that life, which was once vivid, having loved and hated, has just abruptly and thoroughly vanished. This is the highest realm of a mono no aware. It doesn't tell you what sadness is. It makes you face the emptiness, ku, directly. The Tale of Genji is not just a novel. It is the spiritual base color of the Japanese people. It tells the Japanese, the world is beautiful. But the world is also bitter. Everyone you love, every spring you experience, will eventually become a blank space like the Akumogakyo chapter. But this does not mean we should passively escape the world. Quite the opposite. Precisely because the ending is blank. The process in between is worth our utmost effort to fill, to feel, to love. Even if it is forbidden love, even if it is painful love, it is better than numbness. Because in that moment, in that instant of heartbeat, you confirm that you are alive. Friends, when we close this millennium-old masterpiece, our minds may still be immersed in the soft moonlight of the Heian court. That was an era belonging to the female gaze. It was a sentimental, elegant, and even somewhat fragile era. However, the wheels of history are ruthless. It will not stay in a gentle dream forever. The wind and elegance of the Heian period were finally washed away by the torrent of history. The privileges of the aristocracy ended. Those nobles wearing silk, blackening their teeth, and reciting waka poetry were driven off the stage by a group of people holding swords with eyes as fierce as wolves. This was the rise of the samurai class. When elegance faces barbarism, when softness faces death, Japanese aesthetics did not disappear but underwent a violent genetic mutation. Though a mono no aware that weeps while watching cherry blossoms appeared too fragile when facing the cruel reality of swords and shadows. The samurai needed a philosophy that was tougher, colder, and more capable of supporting them to face life and death directly. Thus, a new aesthetic was born. It no longer pursued completeness. It no longer pursued magnificence. Instead, it began to worship imperfection. Worship poverty. Worship loneliness. It even believed that a broken tea bowl was more beautiful than a splendid palace. This is another difficult term we often hear in Japanese culture, Wabi-Sabi. We will leave the imperial palace of Kyoto and walk into the dry landscape gardens, Karasansui. We are going to see how those samurai, who killed without blinking, found spiritual redemption in a bowl of rough tea soup. We are going to see how that golden pavilion, Kinkakuji, covered in gold leaf, lost to a seemingly tattered silver pavilion, Ginkakuji, in the dust of history. In a flash, 500 years have passed. We walk directly into 16th century Japan. To attend an afternoon tea that is enough to overturn your perception of the word luxury. According to modern common sense or Western logic, so-called top-tier enjoyment should be sitting under the crystal chandeliers of the Palace of Versailles in Paris, or on the velvet chairs of the Ritz Hotel in London. Before you should be exquisite silverware, in your hand a bone china cup thin as a cicada's wing, the air filled with expensive perfume. Everything loudly declaring to you, look, this is wealth. This is perfection. This is the peak of human material civilization. But in the world of Japanese aesthetics, this logic is completely shattered. You walk through a dark, damp forest, underfoot is a stone path covered in moss. You arrive in front of a small thatched hut that looks like it is made of mud and straw, crumbling and shaky. This room is pitifully small, not even having a decent window, only small windows propped up by bamboo letting in weak light. Even more ridiculous is that the entrance to this room is a small hole only half a person high. In Japanese, it is called Nijiraguchi, crawling entrance. Whether you are a powerful shogun, a wealthy merchant, or a samurai who has killed countless men, to enter, you must unbuckle the katana at your waist and throw it outside. Then, like a beggar, kneel on the ground and crawl in on hands and knees. When you crawl into this dim, narrow space the size of only 2 tatami mats, you smell no perfume, only the faint scent of earth and a wisp of smoke from the incense burner. The room is empty. No crystal chandeliers, no gold or silver treasures. In the gloomy alcove, tokonoma, in the corner, there hangs only an abstract ink wash painting, or sits a single inconspicuous, perhaps even withering, wildflower. Your host, an old man with a withered face, is kneeling there. What he hands you is not an exquisite bone china cup, but a black, irregularly shaped ceramic bowl with a surface as rough as a stone. If you experience this for the first time, you might feel insulted. Is this the legendary Japanese tea ceremony? Is this the aesthetic they are so proud of? Isn't this just poverty and tatteredness? But if in this moment, your heart feels an unprecedented tranquility in that small space. If you see a luster more profound than gold in that rough black bowl, then congratulations, you have touched the second realm of Japanese aesthetics, the soul most difficult for Western logic to understand. A Wabi-Sabi. If the Ramono no Aware we discussed before was the tears of Heian noblewomen under the cherry trees, soft and sentimental, then a Wabi-Sabi is a deep breath taken by Sengo, warring states, samurai amidst the glint of swords. It is hard, cold, and even cruel. A huge historical rupture occurred in between. The elegance of the Heian period was finally terminated by the blood of reality. Those powdered, poetry-reciting court nobles were driven off the historical stage by a group of professional soldiers holding steel blades, the samurai. Think about it, for a samurai, what is life? Life is no longer the groans without illness in the palace. No longer frowning because a poem couldn't be written. Life is leaving home this morning and possibly not returning tonight. Life is having your head cut off by an enemy's sword at any moment, or cutting open your own stomach for honor. In such an extremely high-pressure, extremely impermanent survival environment, though a mono no aware of crying over falling petals seemed too luxurious and too fragile. The samurai needed a tougher spiritual pillar, a philosophy that allowed them to face death, or even embrace death. Thus, Zen Buddhism was introduced from China to Japan and quickly combined with Bushido, producing a marvelous chemical reaction. To understand this dramatic shift in aesthetics, we don't need to read dry history books. We just need to go to Kyoto and look at 2 buildings. These 2 buildings are not far apart, and their names sound like twins, but they represent 2 completely different universes. The first is Kinkakuji, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion. This was built in the late 14th century by Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimitsu. Just like its name, this is a true golden house. It is entirely covered in expensive gold leaf, shining in the sunlight, reflecting in the mirror pond. It is so gorgeous that one dares not look directly at it. It represents the peak of power in that era and retains the last bit of obsession with perfection from the Heian aristocracy. It is outwardly expressive, meant to show off. It shouts to the whole world, "Look how much money I have, look how much power I have." However, just a few decades later, history played a dark joke. The Onin War broke out. Kyoto turned into a sea of fire. Countless treasures turned to ash. On the ruins of this war, the grandson of the Kinkakuji master, Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa, built another temple, Ginkakuji, the Temple of the Silver Pavilion. If it's your first time going, expecting to see a building covered in silver foil because of its name, you will be greatly disappointed. Because there is absolutely no silver there. What you see is a dusty-faced wooden building. Black tiles, raw wooden pillars. Because of its age, the wood has turned black, even cracked in places. There are no precious flowers planted in front, only a dry landscape garden piled with white sand, like a sea of dead silence. What happened here? Did the shogun run out of money? Legend has it that Ashikaga Yoshimasa originally did intend to cover it in silver foil, but due to financial difficulties and war, he couldn't. This looks like an abandoned construction project. But a miracle happened. When people calmed down and looked at this unfinished, gloomy building and the texture it presented under the moonlight, they were suddenly struck. They discovered that the glittering perfection of Kinkakuji makes one tired after staring for too long, even feeling it's tacky. But the exposed wood of Ginkakuji, the mottled traces left by the passage of time, this imperfection. Instead, it reveals a desolate, profound beauty that reaches straight to the heart. This was the birth moment of a Wabi-Sabi. Let's break this word down. A wabi originally meant a poverty, shabbiness. But under the influence of Zen, it became an active choice. It means, I do not pursue material abundance, I seek spiritual freedom in scarcity. A sabai originally meant rust, a withering. In Western aesthetics, rust is bad, old things should be thrown away or renovated. But in Japanese aesthetics, sabaya means the luster of time. A stone covered in moss, an old teacup that has become smooth from being touched by countless hands. The wrinkled face of an old person. These are all a sabai. It represents the process of all things slowly aging and vanishing in the river of time. This in itself is a solemn beauty. So, Wabi-Sabi combined is the ability to find beauty in imperfection, incompleteness, and impermanence. This aesthetic reached its zenith in a tea master named Sen no Rikyu. Sen no Rikyu was the patriarch of the Japanese tea ceremony and the true spiritual godfather of that warring states era. Even the hegemon Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who unified Japan, had to be respectful before him. There is a very famous story about Sen no Rikyu that is enough to shatter your worldview. At the time, Rikyu's garden was full of morning glories, blooming very lushly, famous far and wide. Toyotomi Hideyoshi heard about it. As the ruler of the world, he was curious and told Rikyu, "I'm coming to your house to view the flowers tomorrow morning." Early the next day, Hideyoshi arrived in high spirits. But when he walked into the garden, he was stunned. And then flew into a rage. Because the morning glories in the garden had all been pulled out. Only a patch of bare earth and gravel remained. Hideyoshi felt Rikyu was mocking him and was about to draw his sword and explode. At this moment, Rikyu calmly invited him into that narrow tea room. The tea room was dark, with only a sliver of morning light shooting in. In a rustic bamboo vase in the alcove, quietly stood a single morning glory. Only one. That was the most beautiful, most full, most dew-laden one that Rikyu had carefully selected from the garden full of flowers. The others, he destroyed them all. In that instant, the originally furious Toyotomi Hideyoshi was thoroughly shaken by this single flower, even rendered speechless. Friends, can you understand the violence of this aesthetic? A garden full of flowers, that is nature's piling up, a visual feast. That is the beauty of Kinkakuji. But, killing all the flowers in the garden to keep only this one, this is called condensation. Through destruction, Rikyu compressed the vitality of hundreds and thousands of flowers into this single flower. You are no longer seeing a flower, you are seeing the life of the flower itself. This is a Ichigo Ichie, one time, one meeting. This flower blooms only this once for you. After you see it this time, it withers. There will never be a second identical flower. This extreme, cruel subtraction is the greatest contribution of Japanese aesthetics to the world. It was also in Sen no Rikyu's era that Japanese taste underwent a complete subversion. The nobles of the time all liked to use porcelain imported from Japan, called akaramono, a Chinese things. That kind of porcelain was flawless and made a crisp sound when tapped. But Sen no Rikyu commissioned a craftsman to fire a brand new kind of tea bowl, called a rakuware, rakuyaki. This kind of tea bowl was entirely hand-molded, not made on a pottery wheel. So it was asymmetrical, crooked, with a rough surface. The colors were not bright, but black or dark red like stones. If you drink tea with it, you will feel its weight, feel the grain of the clay. Why did Sen no Rikyu think this broken bowl was more high-class than perfect porcelain? Because perfect porcelain is an industrial product, it is cold. But this crooked bowl retains the craftsman's fingerprints, it has warmth. It is unique. When you hold this bowl with both hands, you are not holding a container, you are shaking hands with another soul. This worship of defects even spawned a unique art, kintsugi, golden joinery. Imagine when your most beloved antique tea bowl is accidentally broken. In the West, or in modern society, our first reaction might be, just my luck. Throw it away. Buy a new one. Or, find the best craftsman to repair it seamlessly so the flaw cannot be seen. But the Japanese don't do that. They collect the fragments, glue them back together with natural lacquer, and then apply gold powder over those cracks. The result is that the crack is not covered up, instead, it becomes a glittering golden lightning bolt across the tea bowl. The value of this repaired bowl is often higher than when it was intact. Why? Because that golden crack is the memory of this bowl. It is its history. It is telling you, I have been hurt. I have shattered. But I did not die. I stood up again. And my wounds became golden medals. Friends, isn't this more than just talking about tea bowls? Isn't this a unique philosophy of life? Every one of us, struggling in this world, who isn't scarred? Our hearts have broken, our dreams have been shattered, our bodies have aged. Though a Wabi-Sabi aesthetic tells us, don't try to hide your scars. Don't try to pretend you are forever young and perfect. Accept your wrinkles. Accept your imperfections. Because it is precisely these cracks that make you unique. This aesthetic gave the Japanese of that war-torn era an incredibly strong psychological resilience. Since the world is impermanent, since Kinkakuji will be burned down, since life is like morning dew. Then, right in this narrow tea room, right in this bowl of rough tea soup, find eternity. They reduced the material desires of the external world to a minimum, thereby constructing an infinitely vast universe in the inner world. This is why, looking at today's Japanese design, from Tadao Ando's exposed concrete architecture to Muji's unbleached products, and even to the Apple minimalism revered by Steve Jobs, their roots are here. They are all in that gloomy Ginkakuji. They are all in that lonely morning glory of Sen no Rikyu. However, history is cruel. It will not let a nation stay immersed in the quietude of the tea room forever. When this ancient, introverted Eastern soul that worships shadows and defects suddenly encountered the strong ships and cannons of Western industrial civilization a few hundred years later, what would happen? Imagine when the black smoke of steam engines soot-stained the white sand of the dry landscape gardens. When Edison's light bulbs illuminated the corners of tea rooms that were originally dark and ambiguous, leaving cracks and dust nowhere to hide. When those men who believed in Bushido had to cut off their top knots, put on suits, and learn to eat steak with a knife and fork. The spiritual world of the Japanese underwent an unprecedented, violent nuclear explosion. That was a shock more terrible than the Onin War because it was an uprooting of the soul. If a Mono no Aware was the tears of the Heian court, and a Wabi-Sabi was the enlightenment of the warring state's samurai, then the third stage is a bloody surgical operation occurring in the depths of the Japanese national soul. Time arrived in the mid-19th century. Several huge warships spewing black smoke sailed into Edo Bay. Those were the black ships of U.S. Navy Commodore Perry. The roar of steam engines was like a heavy hammer, smashing the doors of Japan, which had been locked for 200 years. It also smashed the closed dream composed of tea ceremony, dry landscapes, and haiku. The Japanese discovered in horror that their proud spiritual world seemed vulnerable in the face of Western battleships, technology, and industrial civilization. To survive, to avoid being colonized, Japan began a frantic Meiji restoration. They took off their loose, comfortable kimonos and put on tight suits with high stiff collars. They cut off samurai top knots and grew Western-style parted hair. They even once discussed abolishing Japanese and switching to English. This was an extremely radical elevation. Enter Europe movement. But, friends, please think about it. A person's appearance can change instantly, but what about his soul? Can that soul that feels sorrow under the cherry trees, that soul that gazes at a broken bowl in a dark tea room, really turn into a Western gentleman worshipping reason, efficiency, and individualism overnight? The answer is no. This created a huge, tearing spiritual pain. This pain created the most brilliant, and also the heaviest, page in modern Japanese literature. At this turning point stands a giant with furrowed brows. He is the man later printed on the Japanese yen note, known as Japan's national writer, Natsume Soseki. Why did he become the national writer? Not only because his writing was good, but because he alone bore the pain of this. A clash of East and West civilizations are for all Japanese people. Natsume Soseki was originally a thorough Eastern classical scholar. He learned sinology from a young age and wrote beautiful Chinese poetry. Confucianism and Zen Buddhism flowed in his bones. But as an elite, he was sent by the state to study in the center of the world at that time, London, England. Imagine that scene. A thin Easterner, his mind full of Confucius and Mencius, walking alone on the gloomy streets of foggy London. Surrounded by tall white people, by rumbling carriages, by the overwhelming prosperity and indifference brought by the Industrial Revolution. Soseki did not feel happy in London. Instead, he suffered from severe neurasthenia. He felt like a yellow dog mixed into a pack of wolves. Filled with inferiority, anxiety, and loneliness. He desperately read English books, trying to understand Western logic. But the more he read, the more he felt out of place with his own nature. Western civilization emphasizes our individualism, emphasizes the self, emphasizes that people should be independent like atoms. Eastern civilization emphasizes relationships, emphasizes a harmony, emphasizes that humans are part of nature and society. This strong rejection reaction drove Soseki nearly mad in his London apartment. But precisely this madness allowed him to see clearly the cost of Japan's modernization. After returning home, he wrote I Am a Cat, which made him famous overnight. He very cleverly used the perspective of a cat to look coldly at those Japanese intellectuals who had just put on suits and tried to imitate Western lifestyles. In the eyes of that cat, these so-called civilized people were so comical, hypocritical, and anxious. They talked about Kant and Hegel on the surface, but underneath, they remained a group of petty, bewildered remnants of the old era. The mockery of this cat was actually Soseki's self-mockery of himself and the entire era. But his most profound work is the later Kokoro Heart. This novel remains the best-selling literary work in Japan today because it reveals a cruel truth. Modern civilization gave us freedom, gave us science, but it also stripped us of our sense of security. In traditional Japanese society, everyone was like part of a big family, though bound, they were not lonely. But after westernization, everyone became an island. The sensei in Kokoro, due to a betrayal in his youth, causing a friend's suicide to steal a lover, lived in guilt and loneliness all his life. He could not open his heart to anyone and finally chose suicide. Soseki told the Japanese through this story, this is the curse of a modernity. We gained the ego, but we lost the peace of the heart. There is a very famous anecdote about Natsume Soseki that is enough to illustrate this gap between Eastern and Western cultures. When he was working as an English teacher, one day, a student translated the English by love you into the Japanese where kimi wo eisu, I love you. Soseki shook his head and said, No. Japanese people are not that direct. If we want to express love, we won't say the word love. You should translate it as, the moon is beautiful tonight. Savor this sentence. Western love is direct. It is fire. It is the I possessing and declaring to a you. Eastern love is implicit. It is moonlight. It is the moment of connected hearts when you and I look at the same moon together. Natsume Soseki spent his whole life trying to build a bridge between these two languages, these two souls. But he eventually passed away tormented by exhaustion and stomach ulcers. If Natsume Soseki was painfully stitching the wound, then in this period, there was another aesthetic master who chose another way, resistance. He was Tanizaki Junichiro. Facing the ubiquitous, blinding light of Western civilization, Tanizaki Junichiro wrote an aesthetic manifesto sufficient to go down in history, in praise of shadows. This book is simply a letter of challenge to modern civilization. Tanizaki Junichiro hated the electric light invented by Edison. He believed that Westerners were always obsessed with making everywhere brightly lit, wishing to eliminate all shadows. Their rooms are white, tableware is silver, even dentist offices are blindingly white. But, Tanizaki Junichiro said, this whiteness and brightness killed Eastern beauty. Because Eastern beauty can only breathe in shadows. He gave a very extreme but brilliant example, the toilet. In modern Western toilets, tiles are white, lights are bright, everything is for hygiene and cleanliness, but there is no aesthetic sense. But in traditional Japanese wooden toilets, the light is dim. Outside the window, one might see green leaves and moss. You can hear the sound of raindrops falling on leaves. In such shadows, excretion is not just a physiological need, it even becomes a kind of elegant meditation. He also talked about Japanese lacquerware. If you look at a black lacquer bowl under fluorescent light, you will think it is unremarkable, even a bit dirty. But if you light a candle and look at it in the dim candlelight, you will find that thick, warm black lacquer surface absorbs the light like a deep pool, faintly reflecting a profound luster. Especially when you open the lid, and the white rice or yellow soup inside emerges from the darkness. That beauty is soul-stirring. And Japanese women. Why did traditional Japanese geishas paint their faces so white and blacken their teeth? Under electric light. This looks scary, like a ghost. But in the dimly lit rooms of ancient times with only floor lamps, wrapped in layers of screens and kimonos, that white face would float in the darkness like a dream, creating a suffocating sense of mystery. Tanizaki Junichiro was shouting, "Don't turn on all the lights. Leave a little darkness for us." Because only in the darkness can that ancient, ambiguous Eastern soul filled with the beauty of a Eugen, subtle grace mystery, find a place to dwell. However, the literary man's shout ultimately could not stop the rolling wheels of history. Electric light still illuminated every corner. Steam engines still turned into internal combustion engines. Japan still irreversibly slid into the abyss of modernization. In this chaotic moment of the replacement of old and new, a young writer known as a demon talent appeared. He was a disciple of Natsume Soseki. He was overflowing with talent and became famous at a young age, hailed as a Japan's Kafka. He was Akutagawa Rinosuke. Everyone may have heard of the famous movie Rashomon. Its original novel was written by Akutagawa. Akutagawa Rinosuke was an extremely smart, but also extremely fragile person. He lived in the Taisho era. That was a brief period of relative freedom and democracy in Japan after the Meiji Restoration. But he keenly felt that this society was heading toward madness. He wrote Rashomon, telling a story about truth does not exist. In chaotic times, bandits, samurai, women, everyone tells lies beneficial to themselves. What is truth? What is justice? In the face of survival, these become worthless. This is actually the spiritual dilemma of modern people, value nihilism. Akutagawa Rinosuke struggled in this nihilism all his life. He was obsessed with Chinese classical legends, he wrote Tu Tzu-chun, yet was deeply impacted by Western modernism. He was like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap at any moment. Finally, in the summer of 1927, at the age of only 35, Akutagawa Rinosuke took a large amount of sleeping pills on a rainy day, ending his own life. In his suicide note, he left a phrase that shook the literary world. He said he did not commit suicide because of any specific pain, but because of a vague anxiety. This phrase, a vague anxiety, was like a prophecy, foretelling Japan's fate to follow. Akutagawa Rinosuke's death marked the end of that idealistic era that tried to fuse Eastern and Western civilizations, tried to find a balance between reason and sensibility. His death was like a sensitive canary collapsing in a mine. It meant the poison gas was coming. Sure enough, shortly after Akutagawa died, Japan fell into economic crisis. The specter of militarism began to hover over the archipelago. The nation that once wrote "The moon is beautiful tonight," the nation that once admired lacquerware in the shadows, was about to pick up the butcher's knife and walk toward a war that would destroy the world. Literature at that time was no longer personal moaning but became the roar of the state machine, or the wailing under the ruins. But, right on these ruins about to burn, there were two more people. They would use an even more intense, more extreme way, even paying the price of their lives, to complete the final swan song of Japanese aesthetics. One was Kawabata Yasunari. He tried to rebuild a pure as snow country with words in the ruins after the defeat. The other was Mishima Yukio. He tried to use fresh blood and seppuku, ritual suicide, to awaken the dead soul of the samurai. When we step across that devastated dividing line of 1945, the soul of Japanese literature and the entire Japanese nation entered an unprecedented era of ruins. The defeat in World War II was not just a military collapse, it was a spiritual seppuku. The emperor issued the Humanity Declaration, Ningen Sengen, admitting he was not a god, just a human. In this instant, the edifice of faith that had supported the Japanese for thousands of years collapsed with a crash. On this spiritual wasteland, on the Tokyo ruins scorched by incendiary bombs, stood two lonely ghosts. They tried to use two diametrically opposite, but equally intense ways, to pick up the fragments of Japanese aesthetics and reshape the dignity of this nation. These were the twin stars of the Showa literary world, Kawabata Yasunari and Mishima Yukio. Their story is a story of a freezing and a burning. It is the final swan song of Japanese aesthetics. First, let's walk into Kawabata Yasunari's world. If you met him in that era, you would find him to be a thin old man, eyes always carrying the alertness of a frightened small animal, a man of few words. In 1968, he became the first Japanese writer to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. At the award ceremony in Stockholm, Sweden, facing the flashlights of the whole world, he delivered a famous speech. The title was Japan, the Beautiful and Myself, Utsukushi Nihon no Watashi. Please note, Japan at that time was experiencing an economic boom. The Shinkansen had opened, the Olympics had been held, skyscrapers were rising from the ground. But in his speech, Kawabata Yasunari did not mention a word about these modern achievements. What did he talk about? He talked about Zen monks from 1,000 years ago, about the autumn moon, about the winter snow, about that budding flower in Ikebana. He was like a stubborn gravekeeper. Amidst the noise of modern civilization, he tried to use a glass cover to freeze that old Japan, ancient, pure, full of the beauty of a mono no aware, so it would not be polluted by the muddy currents of the times. His masterpiece Snow Country, Yukiguni, is the pinnacle of this freezing aesthetic. The first sentence of the novel has been memeized by countless people. The train came out of the long tunnel into the snow country. The earth lay white under the night sky. This sentence is like a magic spell. Passing through that dark tunnel, you leave the realistic, dirty Japan and enter a pure white, illusory otherworld where only beauty exists. In Snow Country, the male protagonist Shimomura, a bored Tokyo intellectual, meets Komako, a geisha in the Snow Country. Komako is a living tragedy. She was born low, fell into prostitution to treat her fiancé's illness. She insisted on keeping a diary, though no one read it. She insisted on practicing the shamisen, though her audience was only the snow in the mountains. She fell madly in love with Shimomura, even though she knew Shimomura would take the train tomorrow and leave, returning to his wife and children in Tokyo. In Shimomura's eyes, everything Komako did was one word, a futile. But Kawabata Yasunari tells us, it is precisely this a futility that is most beautiful. It is like a moth flying into a flame. Knowing it will die, knowing it is meaningless. But the moment it burns, it is more dazzling than the eternal sun. Kawabata Yasunari inherited the bloodline of the Tale of Genji. He pushed Mono no Aware to an extremely cold height. He believed that real life is dirty. Only by peeling beauty away from reality, making it into a specimen like a butterfly, can it be eternal. To maintain this purity, Kawabata paid a huge price. His later years were lived almost in a spiritual vacuum. Finally, on a spring day in 1972, 2 years after his disciple Mishima Yukio committed suicide, Kawabata Yasunari put a gas pipe in his mouth in his studio. He ended his life in silence. He left no suicide note. Because for a man who wrote nihilism all his life, death needs no explanation. Death is returning to that blank Akumogakura chapter in the Tale of Genji. He finally turned himself into a never-melting, cold snowflake. If Kawabata Yasunari was the feminine moon, the guardian trying to freeze beauty, then his disciple, Mishima Yukio, was the violent sun, the god of destruction trying to destroy everything through burning. Mishima Yukio. This name itself represents contradiction. He was originally a frail, pale literary youth with extremely high talent, writing delicate, feminine works like Confessions of a Mask. But he loathed such a self. He loathed the atmosphere of post-war Japan, weak, castrated, looking only to the United States. So, he began frantic bodybuilding. He trained himself into a strong man with muscles like a Greek sculpture. He practiced kendo. He organized a private army, the Ratatanokai, Shield Society. He tried to forcibly inject the soul of Bushido into this modern shell that had already put on a suit. To understand Mishima Yukio's madness, we must read his core work, The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, Kinkakuji. This book was adapted from a true event. In 1950, a young monk set fire to the national treasure, Kinkakuji. Under Mishima Yukio's pen, this story became a confession of his aesthetic view. The protagonist of the book, the stuttering, ugly young monk Mizuguchi. Why, after seeing Kinkakuji as so beautiful, did he not want to protect it, but burn it? Because Kinkakuji was too beautiful. This beauty was overwhelming, eternal. It highlighted Mizuguchi's ugliness and wretchedness. As long as Kinkakuji existed for one day, Mizuguchi could never escape his inferiority. More importantly, Mishima Yukio believed that once beauty exists in reality, it begins to rot, it becomes mediocre. If Kinkakuji is not burned, it becomes a background board for tourists to take photos, a tool to earn ticket money, wood covered in bird droppings. Only by burning it with a fire. In that instant when it turns to ash. In that moment when the flames soar to the sky. Does the beauty of Kinkakuji thoroughly break free from material shackles and become that phantom in people's minds that can never be surpassed? This is the beauty of destruction. Mishima Yukio not only wrote this, he did it. He turned his life into a script heading toward destruction. On November 25, 1970. On this day, Mishima Yukio finished the last word of his masterpiece, The Sea of Fertility. Then, he put on a carefully designed uniform, tied a headband reading his 7 lives to serve the country on his forehead. Taking a few students, he barged into the Eastern Command of the Ground Self-Defense Force in Ichigaya, Tokyo. He took the commander hostage, stood on the balcony, and delivered a speech to over 1,000 Self-Defense Force soldiers downstairs. He screamed, calling on the soldiers to launch a coup, overthrow the pacifist constitution, let the emperor regain power, and restore the glory of the samurai. But the soldiers below treated him as a madman, mocked him, and even told him to get down. Mishima Yukio knew he would fail. One could even say he longed for failure. Because only in desperate failure would his death possess tragic sublimity. He retreated to the room, unbuttoned his uniform, took out a short sword, tanto, and cut open his abdomen according to the oldest, bloodiest samurai ritual. The scene was tragic, even wretched. The Kaishakunin, the friend responsible for beheading him, was so nervous he hacked 3 times before cutting off his head. Mishima Yukio's death shook the whole world. Westerners could not understand why a writer most famous in this era, a candidate for the Nobel Prize, would end his life in such a barbaric medieval way. But in the logic of Japanese aesthetics, this was inevitable. Mishima Yukio could not bear to grow old. He could not bear his perfect muscles becoming loose and sagging. He could not bear becoming an old man drooling in a wheelchair. He wanted to fall like a cherry blossom in a storm at his strongest. Most beautiful, most glorious moment. He used fresh blood to draw a blood-red exclamation mark for the Bushido-y aesthetic of Japan. Friends, with Mishima Yukio's seppuku in 1970 and Kawabata Yasunari's suicide by gas in 1972, that beautiful and sorrowful gold Japan. That Japan which still had the soul of samurai and the sentiment of geisha, thoroughly died. These two giants took away the last heaviness and solemnity of Japanese literature. The Japan that followed entered the carnival of the bubble economy. Sony Walkmans, Toyota cars, Nintendo game consoles conquered the world. The Japanese became richer and richer, and more like Westerners. In this era of extreme material abundance but extreme spiritual emptiness, a new spokesperson appeared. He no longer wore a kimono, nor did he carry a katana. He wore t-shirts and jeans, liked drinking whiskey, listening to jazz, and running marathons. He is Murakami Haruki. Murakami Haruki's appearance marked the shift of Japanese literature from a heavier to a light. Or rather, toward another, more modern nihilism. His breakout work, Norwegian Wood, took its title from a Beatles song. This book sold millions of copies in Japan, almost one in every hand. Why? Because it precisely hit the soft spot of modern urbanites. The protagonist Watanabe is no longer burdened by family fate like Genji, nor thinking of serving the country like Mishima Yukio. He is just an ordinary university student, drifting outside the crowd. He watches the people around him commit suicide one by one. His best friend Kazuki committed suicide, his beloved Nooko committed suicide. Facing these deaths, Watanabe did not wail like the ancients, nor seek revenge like a samurai. He simply said a famous line lightly. A death is not the opposite of life, but exists as part of life. This is the modern version of a mono no aware. The characters under Murakami Haruki's pen all suffer from a kind of a high-functioning autism. They are polite, they dress well, they are excellent at their jobs. But their hearts are like dry wells. They cannot establish deep connections with others. They can only chew on that alienation alone under the cold light of convenience stores or in late-night bars. This loneliness is no longer the elegant sentimentality of purplish clouds, but a plastic-like, non-degradable, urban indifference. But, friends, if you listen carefully to Murakami Haruki's words, you will find that under that westernized, cool skin, the ancient river still flows. In Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, he searches for a lost shadow. In Kafka on the Shore, he escapes the Oedipal curse. In 1Q84, he looks for a world with 2 moons. What is he looking for? He is still looking for that a lost thing. Just like Murasaki Shikibu looking for the vanished Genji 1,000 years ago. Like Sen no Rikyu looking for that cut morning glory 500 years ago. This sense of loss is the eternal theme of Japanese literature. Alright, friends. Our journey started from the courtyards of the Heian court covered in falling petals, traveled through the tea rooms of samurai swords and shadows, past the confused streets of London after the Meiji Restoration, witnessed the burning Kinkakuji of the Showa era, and finally stopped at the door of a neon-flashing convenience store in modern Tokyo. We have talked so much. From a mono no aware to a Wabi-Sabi. From a Eugene to a destruction. All of this ultimately points to an ultimate philosophical proposition, which is also the most precious gift Japanese culture gives to all mankind. That is the absolute reverence for a time. Many other civilizations in this world are pursuing eternity. Pyramids pursue the eternity of the flesh. Christianity pursues the eternity of the soul. Modern science pursues the eternity of matter. But Japanese literature tells us there is no eternity. There is simply no such thing as eternity. Your youth, your love, your wealth, the achievements you are proud of, even your current pain. Everything will vanish. Does this sound pessimistic? No. This is precisely the highest form of optimism. Precisely because everything will vanish, precisely because we are like mayflies born in the morning and dying by dusk. Therefore, this very moment, even if only for a split second, appears so precious, so sacred. This leads to the last word we want to give everyone. Ichigo Ichie. This word comes from the tea ceremony. It means, this life, this person before you, this cup of tea drunk here and now. There is only this one chance. In the next second, the light changes, the water temperature changes, your mood changes, maybe even the person is gone. This moment is the swan song. So, what Japanese literature teaches us is not how to die, but how to live. It is asking you to gaze at your lover's face like looking at the cherry blossoms for the last time. It is asking you to cherish your imperfect, even scar-filled life like holding that cracked tea bowl. It is asking you, knowing clearly that the ending is a blank kumogakure, to still have the courage to write the process in between with ups and downs, to write it vividly and thoroughly. Because, apart from the trembling of this very moment, we have nothing. And this moment, as long as you feel it, is eternity. I am Raymond Shadow. Thank you for completing this spiritual journey spanning 1,000 years with me. May you find your own light in every moment of mono no aware. I am Raymond Shadow. Likes and subscriptions are encouraged. See you next time.